is being recorded and will be made available to participants via email and on our website shortly after the session. Before I hand it over to Dr. Carrie Ann O'Meara, who will facilitate the webinar, I just wanted to remind everyone of a few technical logistics. So participants will be able to see Carrie Ann and our other presenters see and hear, hopefully, throughout the session. But as participants, you will be muted throughout. If you have any questions either about content or technical difficulties, feel free to send those to me, the host, Dawn Culpepper, via the chat box. You can access the chat box by hovering over the WebEx application and hitting the small word bubble. And I'm happy to address those questions as they come up and relay those questions to our presenters during the Q&A portion. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. O'Meara, who will get us started.
Thanks, Dawn. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this final capstone project webinar. So we've been working on this issue of faculty workload equity and equity-minded reform for about 4.5 years. And we feel like we've learned some things that we've been disseminating on our website through peer-reviewed articles, through op-eds. But we were trying to think, since we worked with departments, would there be a way we could extract departments in small colleges? Could we extract some sort of key lessons learned that are relevant for university-wide thinking on workload reform? And of course, there are some things that are specific to departments and colleges, and but we also wanted to think about how can we scale this up, what we learned. And so that's what we thought we would do at the very end of this second phase of the project. In the morning, before this, we were able to have a report out of our second phase of our departments who talked about sort of their process of moving from data toward diagnosis of equity issues and then the implementation of real policies and practices. And so those folks are joining us, but then we also asked folks to join us who were from other universities, largely within the advanced community, but also that we've met at other presentations and around the country that we thought might be interested because they're also working on this important area of workload equity. I would be remiss if I didn't also note that this is an advanced IHE plan grant. We have been very thrilled to have the National Science Foundation fund this project. And although I'm presenting on behalf of my colleagues, this project has been a partnership with, and project leadership has come from sociologist, UMass Amherst faculty member Joya Misra, and my colleague Audrey Jager at NC State, who's a higher ed scholar like me, as well as Courtney Leonard, who was with us in the first phase of the project, and Dawn Culpepper, who's joining us and keeping us organized as well in the second phase now. So, all right, let's just jump in. I wanted to summarize a little bit of the rationale for this first. So, one of the things that's amazing is that whether you look at faculty surveys like Coach or the UCLA Harry survey, whether you look at the NSES survey that was done of faculty, NSOF previously, whether you look at annual faculty reports where folks submit their CVs or some accounting of what they did last year, whether you do interviews in focus groups, whether you actually have people record what they're doing over, say, a 4-week period or through a 6-month period, or you do an experiment where you say you've got something you need somebody to do, who will you ask? You find a really consistent pattern. So we're not finding this in just one source. We're finding it across different sources that women report relative even within the same institutional type and rank and discipline that they're spending more time on teaching and service activities, less time on research, even, again, within the relevant discipline and institutional type compared to their peers, in other words, and underrepresented minority faculty spending more time on mentoring and diversity-related work like search committees, diversity commissions, advising of underrepresented minority student groups. We also find that women are asked more often for certain kinds of service activities and for non-promotable kinds of tasks. And so So if we were to think through, we move from this data. This is why we wrote the NSF grant. This is why so many folks on individual campuses, for example, that work with their coach data, this is really what they're finding, right? This different sort of perception and often even reality of workload. There's also institutional challenges that institutions are facing in addition to equity issues. They're kind of efficiency issues. Whether they just have the best systems to manage workload, even beyond equity as a main principle. So we have increasingly budget constraints, fewer faculty, a shift from tenure track to more professional track faculty. We have few minimal standards in our policies or guidelines for what faculty are supposed to be doing, especially in teaching and service, so there's a lot of ambiguity there. There are few processes to differentiate between, say, serving on a committee and chairing one, or different levels of work that these different committees are. And we have departments that may have merged. As we were in our reporting out, some departments talked about the creation of these merged departments where there are many microsystems of people doing different kinds of work and then needing to somehow account for that in one workload system. And this is definitely also resulting in extra work for underrepresented minority and women in STEM, especially when folks are being, asked over and over again to be involved in service. And so one of the first things we did in our project is, to address any kind of issue, and I love the work of Acker, who talks about the need to laser in on a problem and really pull out or tease apart its pieces in order to solve it. You want to do some diagnosis, right? So what we did was we pulled apart the different parts of the problem. One is that some faculty are volunteering more often, so they're raising their hand because of commitments that they have to issues. Some faculty are being asked more often, whether or not that's what they want to do or can do. They're just going to get more emails in their inbox or requests in the hallway. Some faculty say yes more often when they're asked, and some negotiate. And there's a little bit of differing kinds of outcomes in some studies across the degree to which women, for example, are saying yes more often, or it's just that they're being asked more often. But then there's also evidence that shows that we see the work that people are doing differently. So for example, if we have, two individuals and we know that we expect that one of our colleagues will say no to some task based on a social stereotype or experience with that person, and then they actually say yes, and they surprise us, we're more likely to credit or reward that work than somebody who always tends to say yes when they are actually doing that same task again. So this is sort of a diagnosis, and it's all sort of given a backdrop with certain conditions that make it more likely we're going to have some problems with the sort of fair perception and reality of distribution of work. There's less accountability in many tenure systems for teaching and service work that's unregulated. So usually we're outside of the normal course assignments of whatever number that is at your institution, but the teaching and the mentoring and teaching related, but not in the classroom kind of work. There's a lack of transparency, just a lot of ambiguity. There's things people want to do and things that are considered sort of highly skilled, or you have to be invited to do, so not all service is equal in that way. And there's not been a conversation in many departments about equity as a priority. There's sort of a perception that, in fact, we're all in it for ourselves, or that a good mentor will watch out for us, or if we have a good department chair, we don't have to worry about equity issues. But in fact, we really do. And it's a collective project, ensuring that there's equity within departments. And so our big, hairy, audacious goal that we have had for this project using the business management literature is really, that we increase or enhance the sense of perceived fairness in the process of how we sort of assign things, or the sense that the process is fair as well as the outcomes are fair. And this is really important because it is linked directly with people's retention and satisfaction, their sense of a belonging in the department, but also the degree to which they're ready to invest. We accomplish most of our goals in higher education through people. We need our faculty not feeling burned out or resentful. We need them all willing to do their share. And so part of this issue of addressing workload equity, although it might seem like opening a can of worms, there's already a can of worms, and we need to really think about, meaning that some people are simmering silently, right? But that resentment, if things are really consistently unfair and nobody's doing anything about it, will cause people to withdraw from a department. And that's social capital and energy that we need to keep in there. So again, the goal of the project over these 4.5 years has been to improve perception of equity, the process, let's say, of how advisees are assigned or courses, who's asked to do things more often. Those are, perception of equity and process issues, but also the reality and the distribution of labor, the outcomes of the entire project. And so the design of our project and what we worked with our departments on was sort of this movement through an analysis of data, both through our pre-survey that we gave folks, but also through the collection of and creation of dashboards or faculty work activity tables, very simple discussions of who's doing what within departments. Now, I will say, in talking with our departments this morning, we had an interesting conversation about the kitchen sink approach and trying to get everything into that dashboard versus sort of very simple displays of data of aggregate or average ranges of what folks are doing by rank. And there can be a tendency when there has not been a lot of data or there's not a lot of data available through institutional processes to want to throw everything in and collect as much data as possible. And so departments definitely struggled with that and told us that, trying to find a balance between not creating too much work for faculty and having to self-report a lot of additional information, but also having more information in the system to make decisions and monitor for equity. So that was an important thing that we did early on with our departments. And really, most of them are continuing to work on this because they sort of got it started, but they feel like there's a lot more to do there. And then we also, having identified equity issues, worked with them on, examining potential policies and practices that could address equity issues. And drafting solutions and getting consensus within the department, trying to make it a department-wide conversation instead of, or college-wide conversation, and making it a collective project, and then ultimately adopting those. We actually did a little video through Annie that we have on our website that breaks down this issue of what are the conditions, again, within which, things might not get taken up, assigned, and rewarded fairly. What are the conditions you want to have? And we put that in a video just to bring your attention to. It's on the front page of our website, and there'll be a link to that at the end. But overall, our project has been trying to shift culture as well. So you're trying to shift sort of the context and the behaviors and the backdrop of how workload is allocated, but you're also trying to change the idea that, if in the past we might say, yes, that person, she seems to be signing up for a lot of service, but I certainly didn't tell her to. And if she does that, that's kind of her call, it's her call, her problem. She should get some time management training. If we didn't design it intentionally to be unfair or to have uneven outcomes, we're not responsible for the outcome, to this sense that, no. If things are becoming unfair for a lot of reasons, some of which might be part of our design and some of which might not be part of our design, we need to redesign. We need to collectively work toward the outcomes that we want. And so part of the new framework is sort of taking agency and accountability for the outcomes, not as well as the process. And so you see a couple articles there that we were able to do within the first 3 years of the project, where we were able to look at departments. We're able, in particular, in these 2 articles, to do 2 things. One was to look at departments that participated in a set of interventions to address workload equity compared to those that did not. And then in this case, we were able to see certain positive outcomes from that process. We published that in PLOS One, including an enhanced sense of transparency, especially from the creation of a work activity dashboard. We were really only able to see the beginnings of what you might call the positive outcomes from the implementation of policies and practices, because of course the outcomes of that would take much time to, ideally they'd be working toward equity and towards people's positive perceptions of equity for some time moving into the future. We also have just had a paper accepted that will appear in Innovative Higher Education about the individual professional development aspect of our project, which was actually time management kinds of training, or basically helping individuals within departments that were interested in thinking about how to better align their time and their priorities. That was an optional part of the project, whereas the departments all participated in the other three areas. And what we were able to see in the other paper was to really be able to predict that departments that report that they have these certain work practices like credit systems or transparent policies for assigning classes or dashboards of work activity, transparent data on work activity. So departments that had these work practices that had in general a set of conditions that framed workload decisions like transparency, accountability, clarity, and in fact ones where faculty reported feeling comfortable being an ally of workload equity, that they would be willing and feel that they would be able to talk to others about trying to make sure this is fair, were all positive predictors actually of what you would want to see, which is workload satisfaction. And they also suggested when those things were present, people were less likely to talk about the desire to leave. I wanted to say very briefly that I mentioned my colleagues earlier, and Courtney's not on here, but many of you might have chimed in from our first phase. Remember Courtney Leonard, but I'm up there in the left-hand corner. On a good day, and Don Culpepper is down there on the bottom. And my colleague Betsy Beese is a physicist here at Maryland who's also been a co-PI on the project. So one of the other organizing frameworks that we use in this project, we've been really excited to write about in op-eds and in our publications, and that's choice architecture. It's basically a way of thinking through, okay, so as you make workload decisions, what are the backdrops that are nudging or shaping what's happening, the decisions that are made and how people feel about it? Excuse me. And so, you know, one of those things, for example, is is there any information in front of us, such as what are the guidelines or expectations for what, say, an assistant professor versus an associate professor is expected to do in teaching, advising, or service? You know, is there any information about what are people actually doing before we go and ask people, additional folks to do things? And so much like the work that's been done in inclusive hiring, where you're really asking the search committee along a process that's sort of stretched out of a good inclusive hiring process to slow down and think about what data they need to make good decisions, what behaviors or actions they need to make good decisions, and not just quickly look through a pile of applications and, you know, quickly make judgments that could be you know, informed by various biases. That's what we've been trying to do with this process. We've been trying to help departments and colleges increase transparency, reduce ambiguity, really pull in more work that faculty feel is hidden work and has been unrecognized into dashboards and into merit criteria, and in a way that it can be put before the merit committee or the annual review process, so that faculty feel that that work is valued and seen. A way to script those asks for who's supposed to do what, you know, such as a rotation of time-intensive roles. So these are all the different kinds of things that the project has been trying to address. And again, we've written about them in many of these places. These articles are all on our website of our project. So what I wanted to do now is summarize for you across what we think we've learned that might be relevant for those, say, in provost offices, deans, thinking about these issues as directors of advanced programs, or associate deans, you know, department chairs, in lots of different roles. And we tried to look at them in ways that we think are relevant for campus-wide reform. So the first thing, the big takeaway that we want to make sure folks realize is that we didn't find one institutional type where there's no problem. Pretty much most of our departments, although some of them had some pretty good data coming in, also realized through unpacking these issues that workload inequity is pervasive for many of the reasons we've already talked about, and it plays out in who gets asked to do things, who volunteers, who says yes, who negotiates for resources when they're asked, who's given resources when they're asked, and what's noticed and given credit. So this isn't a problem for some other institutional type that, isn't like a family and, or some discipline, we're in this kind of discipline, we're all a family, so we don't have a problem. Really, if you dig deep enough and you think strategically and critically enough and use data, there's ways in which we could all tweak our systems to be fairer and more transparent. And in fact, these are the conditions that we found consistently talked about within our the units that we worked with that we think need to be scaled up. We need more transparency, more clarity about guidelines or average ranges about what folks are supposed to be doing. We need to understand what consequences are or how things need to change when those things don't happen. We need enough flexibility to acknowledge people's differences in context. And that means people are going to get different things in their inbox, and how do we acknowledge people doing different kinds of work? We need to cultivate a commitment to sort of an equity-minded approach to this, and we need to be aware that biases are going to influence all of these different things. And we really did have evidence, we have evidence in multiple ways coming from multiple directions. So it wasn't only our survey data that was able to associate the presence of these conditions with faculty reporting more positive workload satisfaction outcomes. But as each of our departments and units went through these deep projects, they just these were the patterns. These are the kinds of things people kept talking about, even if they needed or wanted them at different levels, right? So we were just talking with the department about the need for transparency. And there were some folks who were like, maybe a little bit, but not full transparency. And for obvious reasons, that could make, you can see why some departments want to start slow on that issue of, well, what needs to be transparent and what doesn't. And we always talked about continuums of each of these conditions, but it's important to think about the fact that they are associated with the positive outcomes most of us would want for departments. And it's also important to underscore, and this is very well established in social and behavioral sciences, particularly in social psychology research and in behavioral economics, that there are these backdrops that just make it more likely some groups are going to be disadvantaged. And this happens if you look at studies on negotiation. It happens if you look at certain kinds of evaluation and admissions. It happens in many different circumstances. But basically, if you create a backdrop where there's a lot of ambiguity, where there's a lack of clarity about what we're all supposed to be doing, a lack of consistency in application, or any way to get feedback that about how that was applied this way in this situation, but not in that, you create a backdrop that is like a perfect storm for social and cognitive biases to invade. So for me to, for example, therefore, walk down a hallway and see a door of somebody who is a woman colleague who I think is going to say yes to the request that I would make to do something. So the more that we can reduce these ambiguities, the more we potentially are reducing the chances of bias invading in our practices. Likewise, we were repeatedly able to find a set of practices that were changing those conditions and making them more positive and fairer for people. So in the group that reported out today, folks talked about differentiated workload policies that clarify distribution of work and then credit and value for that work. There are credit systems that you put in place that pull in, say, undergraduate advising, that research advising that folks are doing, or pull in certain kinds of outreach that folks are doing that is critical to the department, and credit it. And routinely, when people feel that these are put in place and really monitoring, helping to steer the ship, we have more positive outcomes. The other thing to say is that most departments are really and units and universities have to come up with this balance between constraints or rules that we have for faculty work and flexibility, right, or discretion. So we're probably much stronger on discretion and autonomy and flexibility right now than we are on rules or guardrails or guidelines or expectations. And so probably most of the work that we've done on equity-minded reform was saying, okay, you're obviously going to need flexibility based on career stage, based on social identities and what that means in terms of biases, but also commitments and who's going to be asked. So you need some flexibility. Of course, department chairs or deans need some flexibility in order to be able to approach people with particular talents in different areas. So that's a given. But we need to shift more toward some of these rules or constraints or guardrails or scripts for our workload activity because the balance is off. And that balance being off is what's making it more likely that some of these workload inequities are happening. So what we need to do is look at how both our data can inform and our organizational practices put into our shared governance plans can really make a difference in adding consistency and accountability. And that's what we found over and over again our department's trying to do. So if you break down sort of the stepwise process, again, of what we learned from what folks did, one of the most important first steps that can happen is creating any display of faculty workload data, even the most simplest displays in a very singular area, like understanding the average number of students that are taught, the average number of courses that are taught. And so, you know, it was really interesting. One of the things that so I mentioned before that our departments really struggled at first with well, my institution doesn't have a system yet. We have not, let's say, bought into a system that has really good fine-grained level of detail information about faculty service activities, or that system doesn't differentiate between, let's say, high, medium, and low service activities. And so some departments or colleges did feel like it would be worth it. And at the University of Maryland, our advanced grant, our IT grant, actually, in a project pre this project, created a sort of basic description of our work activities that is put behind a firewall for folks to have a sense at assistant, associate, and full levels within their college of what folks are doing in service activities. And really, we can't imagine a serious look at equity issues without starting with some kind of data. Now, the way in which an institution or a college or a department starts with that data can be multiple levels. So many universities realized they had a problem through their coach data, which Kieran is going to talk about. But some also learned about it by taking a sort of satisfaction survey that was done locally at their institution or through, in our case, through our project. Or institutional data was created or analyzed and showed a kind of obvious difference in either advising or class sizes. And when looked at by gender was showing something that people were like, I wonder why that is. Let's look at that some more. But most equity-minded reform of reward systems begins with some level of data, even if that's not a kitchen sink approach, but very basic data in especially teaching and service areas. Once that data has been looked at to help diagnose equity issues, the next step is really creating benchmarks for minimal contributions. Now, I was in the earlier session that we had today, one of the project teams called out the term benchmarks, and some folks didn't like the term benchmarks because it sounds like a sort of check that you could make on a list and then you've done it, and that's not the intention. And so you might also call these benchmarks sort of average ranges of folks' activity by, let's say, by career stage or so for example, the average number of students that Focus advise as an assistant professor is between 6 and 8, or et cetera, right? And it's that kind of a thing. And then also within this step is differentiating between things that are sort of high, medium, or low effort. So in this simple table, you see that all the faculty got together and they categorized routine, ongoing campus service into these different categories and assigned differential credit for it. You also would do this by assigning somebody more credit for chairing a dissertation than serving on one, perhaps, or chairing a master's thesis or an undergraduate senior capstone thesis versus serving as one member of a committee where there's maybe one touch with a student. So creating a sense of what's the range of what we're expecting, and then how do we differentiate effort within the kinds of service and teaching activities that we do was a critical next step after looking at data. This is an example of those kind of performance benchmarks, right? That you might have an associate full professor in general at this particular institution teaching 5.5 courses per year. And this is the kind of thing you often see in merit criteria. Some departments or colleges or universities don't have these in place, and they can certainly be done at a larger level. So, for example, there might be a college-wide guideline that everybody has to teach at least one undergraduate class every 2 years, or all faculty should be, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to differ by institutional type. But basically, it's the idea of creating floors and ceilings and ranges and guidelines so that people have a general sense, especially junior faculty, of what these ranges are supposed to be. The other thing that we would say about this, that we would underscore, is that even though there can be some trepidation, even downright resistance to putting data into these dashboards, we really found that once folks did, they appreciated having that data, and they appreciated what it would be able to tell them that related to annual review or merit pay, about whether as a way to monitor equity issues, as a way to think about assigning service annually, as a way of understanding teaching load assignments. So even though there was early resistance and trepidation about the collection of data for faculty workload activity dashboards, there was a lot of appreciation for the value of having it for the most part. I think the most sustainable way to do this, though, is to have a few select representations of the data that are provided and updated annually, to try to avoid the instinct for a unit or a university to categorize everything in these displays, because that won't be as sustainable, and faculty may resist the amount of work that is part of collecting that data. So there's a tension there between how much goes in it and how valuable it'll be and whether or not you'll have resistance to it. But in general, we did find across the board, most of our departments found that it was valuable to have looked at this data and to have it for many different purposes afterwards. And that's part of, and the part of the kitchen sink approach is the idea that when you start talking about workload equity reform, one of the first things that happens is that, because it's not been counted in a significant way for a long time, a lot of colleagues at many higher ed institutions will say, but this needs to count, and this needs to count. And of course you want to pull more hidden, invisible teaching and service work into some system that will count. But it isn't like everything that we do could possibly be put into that reward system, because we're part of a professional, guild or so when I write a letter of recommendation for a colleague who's going up for tenure, there's not a place for me to necessarily put that in my vita. It's often a confidential process. And I'm not sure that it would value higher ed that much to spend too much time on that kind of a thing. Whereas spending time on routine teaching and service activities that tend to be less desirable but critical for the mission of the department, college, or university, like undergraduate research advising, or recognition of really amazing activity in service, the highest effort for leading an accreditation review, kind of a thing. Those things that are mission critical, routine activities are more the things that we want to try to pull in and count in our systems, and not try to credit every single little thing that we do. You know, one of the things that one of the organizational practices that we worked with departments on were credit systems. And this is saying it's a little bit different than guidelines or performance benchmarks. It's a way to say there might be multiple pathways to get to the same level of effort. But also, we want to find a way to credit people who are way above that average effort, right? So there might be standard performance, but then there might be people working way above that standard performance. And there need to be ways in which we acknowledge that by offsetting it with something else within their workload, or allowing for a differentiated kind of policy, which is what you see in this kind of setup of a credit system. The other thing is that when universities go about, I was just visiting with a university, and they were doing university-wide reform of workload and trying to come up with policies that would be relevant for the entire institution. And one of the things we talked about was that no policy was going to make everything even, right? Different colleges on campuses have different financial ecosystems. Faculty, for example, will often make different amounts of money in terms of salary based on their field, because we are part of markets in addition to being you know, members of institutions. Who are also a physics faculty member, a computer science faculty member often has a different salary than somebody in a humanities field. And likewise, the physics faculty member and the music faculty member's workload and exactly how it plays out is never going to be the same. And it's kind of a fool's errand to go into workload reform trying to make it exactly the same, because there are various contexts that are critical and shape workload that are disciplinary and resource-based. But having said that, that doesn't mean that there aren't ways institution-wide for us to create ways of recognizing differential allocation of effort, especially within units where folks are doing some of the same work. So an example of that would be, we might not expect the physics person who's in the lab a lot to look like the music professor who's in studios a lot, but we might expect to create the option for the music professor that is the associate chair of the department to have a workload, a different workload percentage of effort than another person who's in that same college in theater and dance, who would normally, they would have been more similar, but because one is spending more time as associate chair, that differentiated workload makes sense, right? That they would have a difference from the standard performance based on that additional service. So differentiated workloads can be really powerful tools in recognizing differences in context and contributions, but also recognizing the whole of what folks are doing. And also, one of the things that universities can do is think about their guidelines for the range or the sort of floor for what folks should be doing. So in some institutions, it might seem, at some research universities, it might seem like a radical thing. Some state universities, some state legislatures require this, in fact, to say everyone who is a state employee as a faculty member, tenure-track faculty member who works at this institution, must teach at least one course a year. Now, you can see reasons why some chairs might want flexibility for folks that just got large grants to not teach at all. And in fact, there's a financial incentive to sometimes buy out all 4 courses. But then there's also a need to serve students and a need to show the legislature that that's a big part of who we are. And so some universities have created a floor of either everybody will teach one undergraduate class, or every faculty member will teach at least X and no more than Y, right? Some range. And those floors can also be done for advising activities, for class sizes, and it is reasonable to look at what those ranges are that might have relevance across the institution. It's also important to think, whether we're talking with department chairs or deans or institution-wide, that there are some service activities that in fact are, you know, not as equal as others in terms of the career benefits that they will provide to somebody. So we need to account for that when we give credit within departments for different activities. And we also need to make sure that we create pathways for people to get into those more desired activities or ones that add to your career and more visibility at the institution. We need to create policies and practices that create openings for how would I get into that if I wanted to do that, be the chair of the University Senate, on the campus APT committee. Because one of the key sources of unfairness for many people is that they just don't know how. Where's the on-ramp? You know, is this all favoritism? Is there bias there, or is there a way for me to get in at some point? And then last but not least, workload issues are never fully resolved. So the goal of any equity-minded workload reform is really to make progress toward a set of conditions and a fair set of practices, and agree that you're going to revisit contexts as they change, right? Whether that be a new data system that gives you different ways of analyzing your information, a new change toward more professional track faculty, retirements, and a need for more planning on rotations of time-intensive roles. So it's a project that is, you know, constantly being negotiated, and you know, something that that I think, even though you can make great progress on, and we certainly saw departments make great progress on, that in fact it's an ongoing project or effort. And we saw many of these. I want to wrap up because we've got two folks that we want to get in, and that took me a little longer than I thought it was going to. But I'll say that we did repeatedly have departments reflect with us and small colleges on these kinds of problems: intersectional service taxes, research and active faculty whose a proportion of their work was assigned to research, as well as this ever effort to sort of make more teaching and service count. So with that said, I'd like to ask Dawn if she can turn it over to Cheryl, Dean Ehrman, who is the Dean of Engineering at San Jose State University, and was actually in the first phase of our project before she left for that role, and see if she could give us a few thoughts about that presentation and the notes I sent to you earlier, and maybe whether some of these things differ, you know, from the perspective of a chair to a dean.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great, success with technology. Yeah, so Carrie Ann asked me to reflect on just one or two of the things that she covered. So I thought I would talk about the social and cognitive biases, and then also about the organizational practices and policies. So the context for the UMD project, I got involved about a year before I transitioned, and the Workload project was happening in parallel with a Gallup survey, which is similar to a Coach survey, which revealed some disgruntled faculty for various reasons at different parts of the university. And then some other context, I'd been chair for, at that point, I think nearly 6 years. And so I was working to try to improve transparency around the big workload pieces of the pie, research and teaching, trying to share information and actually calling people by name on their research productivity and grantsmanship, to help let folks know who was really, I think, working hard to contribute on those sides. So teaching, we didn't call people out by name on their student evaluations. That's problematic. But we would show some information in an aggregated fashion and then have a lot of one-on-one meetings. So extending it to service in terms of the dashboard was not a huge hurdle for us, I don't think. Most folks were aware of the macro level challenge that women and underrepresented faculty are asked to be on committees. I think that was a known thing. But some of the other results that we had talked about as part of our participation in the project about biases, about how students might come to you for advising more frequently. One of the kind of a tasks that's not really officialized, or how many letters of recommendation people were writing because, you know, the students had engaged with a certain faculty more than others. That was really, I think, not well known until we underwent that. Um, so I think that was it was interesting to try to get that transparency to go around service. Some of the other practices that were suggested around having rotations, formal rotations of the heavy service roles, that would have been a bigger cultural shift than I thought we were ready for at the time. So we didn't get that far. Maybe my successor has been able to do that. But I do think that the transparency helped to protect the faculty that were being overburdened, and it helped to justify, for me as chair, to justify some workload shifts for people that were not as well as heavily loaded up on their service. And I guess relevant context also to my situation as chair, I was the first and still only woman chair at the University of Maryland in engineering. So I'd kind of lived the experience, and I think that maybe that made me slightly more cognitively aware of not overburdening underrepresented faculty. But I think that it wasn't that I was the only person that might think about that a little bit. I think that some of my colleagues that were majority faculty were also more aware than others. So that's my reflections on as a chair. So Maryland is a research intensive, primarily white institution, and so I transitioned to my dean role to a minority serving institution that's a large master's comprehensive, so a very different type of union. Maryland was not a unionized campus, and we are a very heavily unionized campus with a great faculty union. And I think that changes the dynamic in terms of the roles of workload, because we actually have a pretty detailed collective bargaining agreement. And so there is a lot of squishiness in there, but it's a different, you know, service is 20%, and that's what it is. And so that there's an expectation for the folks that are in the union around us, which is a little bit different than I'd experienced in a non-unionized campus. And then the other shift is that going from being the only woman chair ever to going to a place where I'm the second female dean, so they've already had that experience with having a woman in the top role within the college. And then I have 3 female department chairs, and our faculty is 1/3 women. So we're really short on underrepresented faculty, but we're, at least on the gender diversity, we're one of the higher places in the nation for a public university. One of the challenges that we face here, though, is that I think the role of department chair had evolved to more of a servant leader model. And so it's not really seen as a big power grab to get elected as chair. It's sort of like, okay, who's willing to take on this task? And so there you go. So we have it's less about power and more about service. And we have you know, three out of our 9 chairs are women. So there's that. So we're trying to look at what we've actually created a chair position description within our college, again, to try to have transparency about what expectations are. I think our campus is, you know, maybe a little bit more aware, but also there's, you know, time has increased, I think, overall awareness about implicit and explicit biases. So, you know, I think that those are a little easier conversations to have here than at my previous institution. But we do face some other challenges around workload distribution, and especially around workload distribution of research advising. And so that's, it doesn't factor into our formal workload. The increased research activity is relatively new for our campus. And so that's something that we're trying to struggle with right now, to balance that, because students will go to approachable faculty for advising their research projects, which means that some people are more preferred than others, and it does take time. So on the organizational practices and policies, you know, again, we didn't really get towards rotations of the roles. Differentiated workload, I think, is a challenge at the pre-tenure stage. You know, at research universities, unfortunately, I think there's a narrow definition of what is acceptable workload. You know, you have to get lots of grants, publish lots of papers, be an effective teacher, do some service. And if you fall short, especially on the research side, then you're not going to get to stay. And so I think that that's a challenge at institutions that haven't really looked at that. You have options to differentiate maybe later, but it might kill your chances to advance to full professor, which then would open up other opportunities. And then, I think that here we've got a different way, the range of balance between the research and the teaching. There's a little bit more latitude. It's okay to do a smaller amount of research and a greater amount of teaching if you're good at teaching. But it's still, especially for advancing to full, it's still a little problematic in terms of having differentiation that can lead to people being rewarded for doing the work that's necessary to keep a university running. So still lots of challenges. So that's what I wanted to share.
Thanks, Cheryl. Thank you very much. I agree. I've seen a lot of folks put differentiated workload in place more at the associate or professor level. Mm-hmm. And for some folks, it winds up being a tool mostly for fulls who in the last 10 to 15 years of their career start reallocating.
Right.
Yeah, and it's also affected by many unionized campuses have actually put that option in place that I'm aware of, the ability to sort of negotiate a differentiated workload. So, okay, so I want to also invite Karen Matthews from Harvard University and the Coach Project to give some reactions to some of what we found in this project from a sort of national perspective.
And I've been following this work just with breathless anticipation. I think I've told rooms of provosts and deans that I look forward to the next article from this project, like some look forward to the next Nora Roberts novel or something like that. It's breathless anticipation. So I represent COACH, the Collaborative on Academic Careers in Higher Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. So the perspective that I bring there is really through three lenses. First, it's through the COACH survey data. Most of all, and most for the longest period of time, the COACH faculty job satisfaction survey, and all the analyses that have been conducted on those data, which are available to researchers everywhere. So we have several items in that flagship survey pertaining to service, workload, and the rewards and recognitions that faculty might expect for such work. Second, it's through my work with those CAOs and deans and chairs, and that includes attendance at their meetings and other opportunities that I have to listen and understand what keeps them up at night. And then finally, of course, through the Scholarship of Higher Ed, Organizational Change, and which is all colliding here in this ambitious but clearly successful project. So starting with the COACH data, it really affirms O'Mara's and company's findings about, I'll skip the formalities, it really affirms the findings here that, that this is really addressing a real problem in American higher ed. So for nearly 10 years, COACH has been asking faculty about whether their institutions distribute service workloads fairly. And for 15 years, we've been asking about whether they adequately recognize and reward that work at each stage of the tenure track. So at the institutional level, we've used these data to short circuit the assumption that dissatisfaction or lack of clarity with service is just the way things are. That it's just, people complain, or that faculty satisfaction is at an all-time low every year. But through comparative analysis, multi-institutional comparative analysis, we've been able to identify the institutions or the departments where faculty are more satisfied, less burdened, more fulfilled. And we can point out that we can say, no, the inequities on your campus are not the way things need to be, but in fact, they are particularly acute on your campus, and here are some exemplary institutions. So this is really addressing that issue. The published analyses of our data, which are all available on the COACH website, they underline this problem of inequities in the distribution of service and the negative impact of those inequities on faculty retention and success. So this is particularly problematic for faculty of color and women and STEM in the assistant and associate ranks. And in recent years, we've seen a particular attention to associate professors as being the most distressed on this on the tenure track, and even more distressed than, in many cases, than full-time non-tenure track faculty regarding the balance of research, teaching, and service, workload, equity, autonomy, institutional support, et cetera. So I've worked with provosts and deans, but they've been frustrated by the lack of concrete and tested solutions. We have many quote unquote best practices, but we really understand little about what works best. And that's been a real missed opportunity of earlier NSF advanced work, maybe the first several years or so, as I think Sue Rosser pointed out in a Lancet article earlier this year, that we really weren't organized to learn in those sorts of programs. But in the last 5 years, maybe more, a few more, we're starting to see great work like this emerge. So it's through your work and your colleagues' work that, as I said, I'm so excited to provide provosts, deans, and chairs with a prescription for what has been called in the popular press as mid-career malaise. I think it's been wrongly attributed to the failure of the individual faculty member. I once had a tenured senior professor call me and say, how can we use coach data to preempt tenure's mistakes? And I thought that was, I politely informed him, I thought that he was mischaracterizing the problem, that really there's much more institutional culpability for those outcomes of associate professors staying in that rank for a long time. So I've also found that equity is our most effective, by no means our only, but most effective framework for provoking a reexamination of the assumptions, often racist, sexist, heteronormative assumptions about faculty behaviors and routines. But you, like Coach, are doing this with sort of an inclusive ask that invites everyone in equally, and I think that's a really important feature here. So in other words, the FWRP team, you're not asking how much time do you spend willfully or unintentionally oppressing or being marginalized by your colleagues. It's a neutral request that you're asking. Essentially, let's take an inventory of departmental service, and the genius of surprise then is embedded in the disaggregation. It's one reason the coach survey is not called the coach equity survey or even the coach climate survey. It's faculty job satisfaction. And so it seems very bland, but it's actually in the disaggregation where we can show that faculty on the same campus, in the same discipline or in the same department, answering the same questions in audits like yours, yet who are different by gender, by race, rank, tenure status, and so on. When we show that they are experiencing their campus or a policy or their climate in starkly different ways, people on each side of that analysis begin to take the perspectives of others. So one side might ask, have I been wrong all along in my assumptions? And really importantly, for the other side, for the minoritized faculty, they start to realize maybe I'm not crazy. Maybe I'm not, maybe I just haven't been privy to all this information. So we already know from the literature that the greater transparency afforded by your recommendations, we know that they're going to benefit, they'll likely benefit assistant professors and particularly the more minoritized members of that rank. But women in STEM fields and faculty of color at the associate professor rank in particular. But we haven't talked much, or I really see a potential consequence for full-time non-tenure track faculty too, and perhaps for part-times as well. So surfacing their invisible work to tenure stream faculty and perhaps gaining more understanding, therefore more respect in the eyes of their colleagues, is one way that I think this work really builds on or kind of takes up the baton from Adriana Kizar's work at the Delphi project at USC. Because I wonder, as more departments use these tools to distribute labor more equitably, then the faculty who are doing the least or seem to be those loafers, they, rather than give up their privilege and take up all that additional work, they might actually prefer to start including non-tenure track faculty in redistributing workloads. They might, in order to protect themselves, perhaps think more expansively about the roles that non-tenure track faculty might be playing in their departments. So I'd argue that that's not necessarily an undesirable outcome, because Adriana tells us that as the proportion of non-tenure track faculty has increased, fewer tenure stream faculty are bearing this greater load of service and governance. So a reckoning is nigh. including non-tenure track faculty in the governance and civic life of the institution, and recognizing and rewarding them for that through paths to promotion, might help us imagine a more complete departmental picture of differentiated workload, which, interestingly, Kezar also recommends kind of through a different path. So I think we're coming at this, I think this beginning to build what amounts to a consensus in this work. So when I shared this with the provosts and deans at an institute I lead at Harvard, or when you did, I just want to share an unequivocally enthusiastic feedback that somebody wrote, "I finally began to understand how individual development and organizational development could work together in a higher ed environment." So these folks, these provosts and deans, are over recent years starting to implement more thoughtful chair leadership development programs. And some small college consortia are doing the same, like the Great Lakes College Association and Associated Colleges of the Midwest. So higher ed studies are showing that we know that chairs impact workload, access to resources, inclusion in decision-making, and collegiality. So if culture happens on the shop floor, then chairs are the foreman. So the academic leaders I've been working with are really encouraged by FWRP. And I think they should be working now to incorporate these recommendations into their chair development programs. So chairs can, even if they're not ready to adopt this right away, they can start working to build those necessary conditions that you mentioned, those 6 necessary conditions in their own department to advance the use of service dashboards like these. I do want to point out a couple challenges that we might anticipate. You point out that discretion or flexibility in the distribution of labor and rewards is how shenanigans intrude. So routine organizational practices, they do improve transparency, clarity, consistency, and accountability. But what I want to make sure is that we've thought through the unintended consequences of what appears to be a more bureaucratic technical approach than just sort of the, we'll all figure it out, or everybody knows how things work around here, assumptions of the past, which I'm not saying are better, but they're different. And when Coach started with a point of view that greater flexibility would actually improve the chances of tenure for women and faculty of color, that's where we saw programs like Stop the Clock and other family support policies that were spotty back then become de rigueur. And one consequence, though, as one study suggests, is that men are actually benefiting as much or more from those policies than are women. So again, not to say that we shouldn't proceed, but that I would really love listening to scholars and practitioners together, perhaps you in the audience, explore the unintended negative consequences of flexibility then, 10, 15 years ago, and then ideate now about potential consequences of even the most well-intended policy changes. So what might go wrong, essentially, with dashboarding, credits, or differentiated workload, so that we can better anticipate those potential problems. And maybe even identify circumstances in which they might not work. So having come from, a second challenge I mentioned is that having just come from the Association of Public Land Grant Universities meeting in San Diego, I heard administrators there comment that faculty activity reporting systems like Interfolio or digital measures are becoming yet another burden, an administrative ask that, while valuable if the data are used, are nonetheless a distraction from the teaching and research that reward faculty. So where the rubber meets the road, I think the equity dashboards will be seen as yet another top-down fiat, perhaps from the 5th provost in 6 years, right? So the organizational change literature suggests that this work ought to be initiated selectively at first. As excited as our academic leaders are about this, to think about it as a campaign, starting probably in the departments where it is more likely to succeed, or where those 6 institutional conditions already exist to a greater extent. So just an encouragement to proceed with a thoughtful phased change strategy, rather than trying to accomplish it all with one stroke. The last thing I'll mention, I'll conclude with what I'm really excited about, is about how these tools can be used developmentally. So this approach is finally treating departments as teams, not a loose coupling of superstars. Department as barbershop I've once heard it described, or as an ensemble, not a soloist. So when the unit of analysis becomes the department, we think about the department's success, and it's less of a zero-sum game that, when counting service, if we count service more, it means counting research or teaching less. So the individual faculty member, on the other hand, can really be supported by a PIC crew, their departmental colleagues, who can lean in. When all this is transparent, they can look at this dashboard and say, hey, maybe you're doing that again. You're leaning more into your habits instead of where you're most comfortable, instead of developing your backhand. There's things that we all need you to succeed at. When all of that service is transparent to everyone, and I'm talking within the different dimensions of service, as well as service compared to those other activities. So when all that is transparent to everyone, the departmental PIC crew can either demonstrate consensus that what you're doing is important and should be valued, or that you're spending too much or not enough time around advising students, grading papers, prepping a course, writing letters of recommendation, and of course on research tasks too, or service to the discipline, or even tasks outside the professional space. So that individual faculty member can use the data and be empowered by that data as the basis for an authentic discussion with her chair, her dean, her colleagues within or beyond the department, with a conversation that might start like, hey, it looks like I'm spending a lot more time than my peers on writing letters. Can we talk about this? Is this valued? Is this going to be rewarded? How do I manage this better? So I've been inspired lately by what Keegan and Leahy at my school described as the deliberately developmental organization, or DDO. So I would ask those who really want to implement these ideas, whether they've embedded them with an element of mutuality. And so what that means is, are presidents, provosts, and deans prepared as well to be transparent about their time use? Because I lost count of the times of the professors I've heard say about their dean, their provost, or president, I have no idea what he does all day. So just perhaps be a little provocative is to wonder if our academic leaders, as well as our faculty, were to share their time use, perhaps we'd all understand each other a little bit better, support each other a bit better, and actually know the real selves, not the caricatures painted in the faculty senate or on the boards or by legislators or in the media.
Thank you, Karen. That was fantastic. Really, really helpful to have that broader perspective. And I love ending on how we need to learn together. I think that, that's critical. I think you will have folks that are out there, these recommendations that basically talk about a stepwise approach. But, one of the things that the last thing we wanted to say, and then I'll see if there's some questions that people want to raise that Dawn might have collected while we were talking, is this idea that, we really can do something about this. And we've really taken this on in significant form nationally with hiring, inclusive hiring efforts. Doesn't mean we're there by any means, but there's just many large national initiatives to address issues of diversity and inclusion in hiring and all the work we need to do in that area. We've taken it on in teaching and cultural competence. There are groups that have started to look at if they see a symposium that's completely all of one group, let's say white men, women also know stuff to create a sort of accountability structure to say, well, no, let's do something about this. Let's try to get women on panels. And so our project was really about saying we could also do something about workload equity, and there are evidence-based practices that could nudge this a little bit forward. And I would add to that, especially organizational practices, conditions, and this developmentally, this constant learning organization that Keegan and Leahy that Karen just mentioned, the idea that, and it also combines with what Cheryl said about how we need to really think about our context. A lot of what her comments reminded us of is that each context is very different. And so understanding how to apply these tools in different contexts, but with a learning mindset is I think, a key thing or a takeaway we would have. So Dawn, are there any questions you want to pull out from anything that might have happened on the chat box? I actually can't see it from my view.
People can still send me questions directly and I'll relay them to the panelists. One question we had that Dean Ernman brought up briefly was to talk about working at institutions with a union and specifically how that may shape collecting data or discussing workload equity policy practices and changes.
Working with a union was the comment, I'm sorry, the question part of it, or was it just the comment that, okay. Yeah, I think that, you know, I had this experience years ago. I was at a unionized campus. Joya is, of course, at a unionized campus. And one of the, at UMass Amherst, and the Amherst system, excuse me, the UMass system is unionized. I think there's this, on the one hand, unionized campuses provide a vehicle for negotiation of these policies and practices that will then protect them in place, that allow faculty some scaffolding for fair workloads because they're in very concrete policies and practices that the institution is accountable for following through on. And there are serious grievance, you know, there are ways to call, you know, that as grievance when those policies are not followed. On the other hand, there can be a worry among faculty when union folks are representing that any policy or practice will somehow add more work to faculty, that say creating a range means that you'll be nudging up the range by just listing it, right? For example, in a policy. So you can see how you can see how, you know, context is key in implementing these things, and I can see ways in which unionized campuses are both places that could really, that do and can benefit from these kinds of policies and practices and even facilitate these conditions, but also ways in which people would be wary and it could take longer to get some of them put in place.
We had another question regarding defining high, medium, and low service activities. And actually, I'll go ahead and say that in the slides that we presented today, one of the examples that we had was a policy wherein the committee made some definitions. So again, we'll share the slides with all the participants who are registered, and hopefully it will be helpful for answering that question. Another question we had was, if the chair's role has changed into solely a servant leader position, how can chairs be encouraged to quote unquote grow teeth and take back some of the power with an equity frame in mind, of course?
I wonder if that's a question for Cheryl, since she raised that issue.
Yeah, so
Cheryl, any thoughts? Go ahead.
I mean, I wouldn't say that it's purely servant leader. But I think it is going that way. I mean, for us, you know, we did into our chair position description, we did write in that we should take the leads on working with the department to develop strategic vision, which I think is ways to more proactively move departments forward and would allow chairs to give input in a way that's not quite the same as just, you know, checking the boxes and doing all of the work that nobody else wants to do. So with trying to do this, trying to get that position description was a big move forward for us.
I'll just add that one of the things that we realized was a competing commitment, I guess you would say, or as Keegan and Leahy would talk about it, of real culture change within departments, was that we would talk with departments who felt like, well, we don't need to implement any of these things or collect data because we have a really great department chair. And, you know, one of the first things, in fact, when Cheryl left that we talked with the rest of the department about was that, you know, she might have been doing things when she was department chair that she just did out of an equity-minded lens that were never written down. And so, you know, getting things that are done by a good department chair as collective commitment as part of your shared governance processes protects the system that they will then just be things that are ongoing, whether or not your department chair thought of them or is particularly equity-minded, et cetera. But the bigger thing is you're trying to create a set of systems or policies and practices that create sort of like a default that is very equitable, and then your chair is critical on top of that in even being able to do more. It's like raising the floor, right, to a higher level where they don't have to be begging people to go into rotating roles because there's a rotation, or you know, the merit criteria include invisible work, so they don't have to be the only one seeing it in annual review. So we tried to get folks to think about it. This isn't like you have a great, you know, the only way you need to do any of these things or should even consider them is if you have a bad department chair, or that it's your department chair's fault if there's workload equity data or coach data that says there's some issues. It's really a collective problem or challenge, and therefore it's got to be a collective approach to a solution. I think we've come to 12:30. So I think what we're going to need to do is close up shop, because I think we ended 12:30. But let me say thank you very much to all of you who called in and participated, especially though to Kieran Matthews of Coach at Harvard University, and to Cheryl Ehrman, Dean at San Jose State University, and formerly a TERP of the University of Maryland. On behalf of our colleagues, we've learned so much in this project. We are going to place, we're going to send the PowerPoints for this or the recording out to you, and we would ask that you would only use it for your own purposes and not post it on a web. We would prefer that. We also have additional publications we're hoping will come out of our project that we'll post on our website and can send out. We've written, for example, a piece on creating dashboards, faculty work activity dashboards. We will have one on these routine practices that we hope to share. Probably another op-ed or two before we're done with the project at the end of next summer. So please look out for what we're able to share as a group on what we learned. And I've already taken several notes from what I learned from this conversation and the whole capstone experience. So on behalf of my colleagues, thank you very much. You see some of those additional papers there. And I think with that, Dawn, is there anything else technical we need to say or before we sign off?
That is all. If you have any further questions, please feel free to contact me, and we're happy to share resources or connect you to information. But thanks so much to everybody for joining.
Thank you. Bye-bye.